This story is about a man named Gu from the western side of the city. His parents died young, and he had only one older brother who spent his days idly and was addicted to gambling. However, bad luck always followed him. Whenever he had money to gamble, he would always lose terribly. He won very little, but lost a lot. After losing everything once again and having no way to earn money, he started thinking of ways to recover his losses. After thinking it through, he came up with an idea. He stole a piece of meat from the butcher's shop in the market and took it to his brother's house. His brother had helped him many times, but now he had become disappointed and no longer wanted to lend him money. But this time, to borrow money, Gu lied, claiming that he had quit gambling and needed the money to marry a wife. So, once again, Gu managed to deceive his brother. After getting the money, Gu turned around and went straight to the casino. And, of course, he lost everything in a flash. On his way home, he began to worry because his brother had said he would come to visit and meet his new daughter-in-law. As he was walking back home, he passed a forest near the village and suddenly saw a paper figure of a girl on an old tombstone by the roadside. It was common in the village for people to make paper figures when someone passed away, but for some reason, they didn't burn them. So Gu decided to take the paper person home to trick his brother. After bringing it home, he placed the paper person on the bed and covered it with a blanket. When his brother came, all he had to do was let him take a quick look from the outside and say she was ill, and the trick would be successful. The next day, as planned, Gu's brother arrived at his house. When asked about the new wife, Gu lied, saying that his wife was sick and resting inside. However, his brother had been deceived by Gu many times, so he wanted to check for himself. He insisted on going inside to see how his wife was doing. While the two were arguing, the paper person stepped out from inside the house and turned into a real living person. The girl greeted Gu's brother, and Gu was stunned with shock. Not believing his eyes, Gu couldn't understand how the paper figure could turn into a real person. The more he stared, the less he believed it. The wife was polite, bringing food and cooking, and she knew how to behave. This made Gu's brother very pleased, and he even wondered how someone like Gu could be fortunate enough to marry such a woman. However, Gu didn't dare to look at her directly. He appeared anxious, thinking that the paper wife might be a ghost transformed. After dinner, the couple saw Gu's brother off. However, Gu was extremely nervous. Once they entered the bedroom, his paper wife suddenly transformed into a gentle and beautiful girl, slightly seductive, which made Gu feel flustered. Then, the wife invited Gu to rest on the bed. Gu stood frozen. The paper wife glared at him and shouted, "Didn't you want a wife?" This made Gu almost wet himself. He gritted his teeth, climbed onto the bed, and pretended to sleep with his eyes closed. However, he was terrified and felt cold all over. At midnight, when he thought the paper wife was asleep, he tried to calm his nerves. He glanced over to make sure she was really asleep. Quietly, he got off the bed and grabbed a wooden stick. He gathered all his strength and struck the head of the paper figure, creating a large hole in its head. But suddenly, the paper wife woke up and sternly asked him why, after helping him, he was now repaying her by harming her. She then lunged at him, tightening her grip around his neck. Gu felt a suffocating pressure and intense fear. She squeezed his neck so tightly that he lost consciousness. When Gu woke up, it was already morning, and he found himself holding the paper wife, who was now lying next to him in a cemetery. From that point on, Gu was so terrified that he became ill and gave up gambling for good. This terrifying story spread throughout the town for a long time. It was about a man named Liu. Despite being from a wealthy family, he never married and secretly had an affair with a girl named Kim from the town. Every midnight, according to the appointment she had made, Liu would sneak over to her place. The girl always found ways to ask Liu for money, and he, indulging her every whim, gave her everything she wanted. Thus, the two had been seeing each other for over 2 years. With her flirtatious nature, it didn't take long before Kim started seeing a younger man named Fen. She realized that being with a strong and handsome young man was much better than staying with an old man. She also learned of some secrets regarding Liu's hidden wealth, which made her concoct a deadly plan. One night, while being intimate with Liu, Kim poisoned his wine and made him drink it. Mr. Liu died from poisoning, and Kim, along with her lover, staged a scene, claiming that Liu had died from a stroke. After Liu passed away, Kim and Fen took over his wealth and soon married each other. Not long after, Kim gave birth to a healthy son, and Fen was overjoyed. Their family life seemed perfect. The child grew up healthy, and there were no unusual events. However, when the boy turned 17, something horrific happened. One day, while the family was preparing for dinner, the boy went into a room and picked up a knife, charging at his parents. Both of them were terrified. How could their usually well-behaved son suddenly go mad and try to kill them? Unexpectedly, the boy spoke, saying that he had to kill the adulterous couple, for the king of hell had returned him to the mortal world to seek revenge. When the boy spoke like this, both parents were shocked and horrified. Hearing the voice, which was not that of their son, the couple realized it was Liu's voice. He had been the one they killed many years ago. They were terrified beyond measure. However, the son's strength was not enough to harm Fen and his wife. In desperation, they invited a monk to chant sutras for the soul's peace. To be extra cautious, they also invited Taoist priests to perform rituals to catch the ghost. They locked their son in the storage room for over 10 days. The boy became so gaunt that he almost looked deformed, but he no longer caused trouble. A month later, when the son had regained his health, they released him and prepared a lavish meal to nourish him. After a while, the couple raised their glasses to toast, unaware that beside them, their son was smiling devilishly. No one could have expected that the son had poisoned the wine and food. The mother clutched her throat in pain. By the time they realized what had happened, it was too late. The couple vomited blood, writhing in agony. It turned out that the ghost of Liu had never left the boy's body. It had been patiently waiting for an opportunity to exact its revenge. After killing the couple with poison, the ghost of Liu, inhabiting the boy's body, smashed all the wealth in the house. Then he took all the money to the street and handed it out to passers-by. Finally, he set the entire house on fire. Afterward, the young man wandered aimlessly, and one day, the villagers no longer saw him around. There was a young scholar named James Bond who journeyed to the capital to participate in an exam. Along the way, he stopped at an inn as dusk was approaching, and he wanted to rest for the night. Due to his poor background, with only a small amount of money, he couldn't afford the inn after hearing the landlord's price. After asking at several other inns but finding them all too expensive, he decided to look for an abandoned temple or some shabby hut to spend the night. Guided by a passerby, he found an inn offering a very attractive deal. The first night was free, and if he stayed longer, he would pay half the regular price. Hearing this, Bond was delighted. Upon entering, he noticed that the place seemed empty, and he greeted the landlord, asking to stay for the night. The landlord was quite strange, showing no joy at having a guest, and bluntly told him that the place was haunted. He warned Bond that if he was scared, he could leave. Hearing this, Bond clicked his tongue, not afraid of ghosts. All he needed was a place to sleep, and besides, the price was incredibly cheap. The landlord then cautioned Bond that if anything happened during the night, he shouldn't hold him responsible, as Bond was staying for free. That night, the young man tidied up a bit and lay down to sleep. In the middle of the night, the air suddenly turned cold, and Bond heard a soft female voice calling his name. He sat up and saw a graceful woman standing by the bed. She said that this was her room and she was glad someone had arrived. Upon closer inspection, the girl had a beautiful face, but her eyes were bloodshot and there was a bruise on her neck. Recalling the landlord's warning earlier, Bond realized she was a female ghost, so he politely asked her to leave, stating that he was still a virgin. She replied that she meant no harm and only wanted to show him a magic trick. The girl picked up a rope and asked Bond to look at it, promising he would see a magical world. Inside the rope, scenes of beautiful landscapes appeared. Occasionally, beautiful young women appeared, bathing in a cool stream. Even I, the storyteller, felt moved by this scene and almost wanted to pause the video to admire it further. After a while, scenes of golden mountains and silver seas appeared, truly something only found in dreams. After showing Bond these sights, the girl said that if he stuck his head inside, everything inside would belong to him. However, those words didn't seduce the young man. He replied that he'd seen enough magic and needed to sleep, so he could set off early the next day. The girl was surprised, never imagining that someone could dislike such things. Bond explained that these were mere illusions, and he didn't want what wasn't his. Unable to entice him, the girl transformed into a monster with a green face and a long tongue, intending to scare the young man to death. However, he wasn't frightened at all. He said that he had done nothing wrong and wasn't afraid of ghosts. Then, simply covered himself with a blanket and continued sleeping. Before sleeping, he even advised the female ghost that she shouldn't scare others like this and should reincarnate soon. The woman, never having met someone so peculiar and resilient, was deeply moved. She was truly touched, realized many things, and then disappeared. Afterward, the young man had a peaceful sleep until morning. When the landlord saw that Bond was still alive and unharmed, he was greatly relieved. The rumors about ghosts in his inn were finally put to rest. Not only did the landlord waive Bond's room fee, but he also gave him some money for the journey. The young man later passed the exam and became a famous actor. This frightening tale took place at an inn on the outskirts, owned by Mr. Pepe. On that day, the inn was fully booked. The owner decided to close early, clean up a bit, and rest. While cleaning the tables and chairs, Mr. Pepe heard a knock at the door. At first, he intended to refuse entry. However, the knocking grew more insistent. When he opened the door, Mr. Pepe explained to the visitors that his inn was full, and he apologized for the inconvenience. But the guests said they were friends of his son, and last week they were invited to stay at the inn if they ever passed through town. Mr. Pepe again insisted that he hadn't received any information from his son and asked them to understand. The group leader directly said that it was late and they couldn't find another place, so they asked if they could stay in the storage room or somewhere else. Feeling sympathetic, Mr. Pepe finally relented, saying there was actually one room left. But, unfortunately, his daughter-in-law had passed away suddenly, and her body was outside the room. Understanding the situation, the man reassured him that it was no problem for them. With Mr. Pepe's guidance, the group moved to the room. To them, sleeping outdoors was the real fear. Staying in the room was no issue. The owner led them to a room in the backyard, explaining that his son was out buying a coffin for his daughter-in-law and wouldn't be back in time. As Mr. Pepe had said, outside the room was a spirit bed covered with a thin privacy curtain, and beside it, a burning oil lamp constantly flickered. The body was covered with paper cloth. Among the group was a young man named Conan, who was more timid compared to the others. Seeing the corpse on the spirit bed, Conan felt a chill in his heart. It was his first time encountering such a terrifying situation. Mr. Pepe led the 4 men into the room, where there was a large bed for them to rest. In a flash, all 4 men stripped off their clothes and climbed into bed to sleep. 3 of them seemed quite careless, while Conan, a virgin who was experiencing this for the first time, was extra cautious. He tightly covered himself with the blanket and stayed alert. Just as he was about to close his eyes, he heard a creaking sound coming from the spirit bed, as though someone had sat up. Slowly, he turned his head, glancing in the direction of the noise. Conan feared that in the middle of the night, someone might jump on him, and that would mean the end of his 20 years of innocence. But then, what he saw terrified him. From the spirit bed, the body of the woman suddenly sat up. She then stood up and hovered above the ground, moving as if she were floating, eerily resembling a cat jumping onto the body. Suddenly, she turned her head and looked at the 4 men sleeping. Her face was yellow like wax, her eyes bloodshot and lifeless, staring at them intently. In an instant, her body lunged toward the 4 sleeping men. Conan could now clearly see that only the tips of her toes touched the ground, while her entire body floated above it. She approached the bed where the 4 men were sleeping. Luckily, Conan had covered himself well with the blanket, while the other 3 were snoring like the dead. She leaned down and sucked the soul of the first man. Oh my, so it was a soul-sucking ghost. In an instant, the man was dead. This scene was oddly familiar, just like in a Stephen Chow movie. After sucking the souls of the other 3 men, the ghost girl noticed there was still some yang energy under the blanket, but she couldn't suck it because Conan had tightly wrapped himself up. Suddenly, a loud cat's meow echoed. The ghost girl turned around and floated back to the spirit bed. Conan wanted to wake his friends and run, but when he pulled back the blanket, he discovered that all 3 of his friends were already dead. He moved, making noise, and the ghost girl immediately appeared by the bed. At this point, Conan was trembling with fear. She tried to suck Conan's soul, but it seemed the blanket was blocking her. Hearing her return to the spirit bed, Conan quickly dressed and stealthily made his way outside. His heart pounded as his legs shook, but he forced himself to move. Just as he stepped outside, Conan was so frightened that he let out a fart. The ghost girl immediately sat up. Conan thought to himself, "This is it. There's no way to escape now." In an instant, the ghost girl detected his movement. Conan, barely alive, ran as fast as he could, but the ghost girl was hot on his heels. It was the middle of the night, and the road was deserted. Oddly, even though Conan screamed loudly, no one could hear him. Conan kept running in one direction, as though he instinctively knew where he needed to go. He spotted a temple on the side of the mountain, and he thought that might be his salvation. The further he ran, the heavier his steps became. For the first time, he truly understood what it felt like to be chased by a ghost. Unfortunately, when he reached the temple, the gate was locked. He pounded on the door desperately, but no one answered. In the blink of an eye, The ghost girl had caught up with him. At this point, it seemed Conan had no strength left to run and could only hide behind a large tree. The ghost girl continued chasing from behind, and he could only run around the tree. One ran and the other chased, circling around the large tree. Conan was terrified and panicking while the ghost girl kept chasing. His breathing became labored and his heart pounded in his chest. Every time the ghost lunged at him, he dodged, knowing this chase better than anyone. Gradually, Conan realized the ghost girl's weakness. She was like a zombie, chasing the yang energy of humans. With her arms wide open, Conan quickly thought of a way to trap her. He stepped back, but she reached out with her hands, hooking them into his finger, driving it straight into the tree trunk. She struggled a few times but couldn't free herself. Just as Conan had predicted, the ghost girl was stuck. At this point, he thought to himself, if I were straight, I would say, "Hold on, I have an idea." But after running a few steps, Conan felt a sharp pain in his chest, and his vision began to blur. He struggled, crawling to the temple gate before passing out. By the time the sun rose, the temple grounds were completely still. After a few temple bells rang, a monk came out and opened the door. Upon seeing the man lying on the ground, he was startled. He then noticed the woman clinging to the large tree, which was even more shocking. She was still clinging tightly to the tree, unmoving. The monk quickly rescued the young man and reported to the authorities. The authorities arrived and pulled the woman away from the tree. They then called the innkeeper to claim the body and take it away. The 3 men in the room had died, and Conan recounted the whole story to the authorities, who did not cause him any trouble. After proving that the deaths of the 3 men had nothing to do with him, Conan took a carriage back to his hometown. This terrifying story is about a young man named Justin Bieber who went to the capital city to participate in a talent contest and was relying on a broker to help him find accommodation. When the broker took him to view a relatively cheap house, they happened to encounter a man from the neighboring house going insane. The broker casually mentioned that the man was mad, claiming that a female ghost was haunting him, constantly screaming and causing trouble like that. The broker then led Justin Bieber to the house next door, which was quite old and somewhat scary, but the rent was cheap. The broker gave him a tour of the house. Apart from one locked room, the other rooms were free for him to use. He warned Justin not to open the locked room, as it contained many of the owner's old belongings. He chose a relatively cleaner room, and after tidying it up, it was already well into the night. As he was about to lay down on the bed to sleep, he suddenly heard the sound of a door opening outside. The noise caught his attention. Then he thought to himself, wasn't he the only one renting this large house? Could it be a thief? So he quietly opened a window to look outside. To his surprise, the locked room's window suddenly opened, and strangely, he saw a faint white figure inside, as if someone was there. Suddenly, a woman dressed in white flew out of the window. It was terrifying, a female ghost with a demonic face. Justin, curious, mustered the courage to follow the ghost's movements. He saw it fly past the wall into the house next door. Perhaps the man who went mad earlier had been haunted by this female ghost. To make sure he wasn't seeing things, he cautiously went outside and approached the locked room. He peered inside and thought that if he told this ghost story on stage, it would definitely cause a sensation, and people would pay attention to him. So he suppressed his fear and decided to uncover this secret. Inside the room, he saw a coffin. The terrifying part was that the coffin lid was open. Justin, being quite brave, jumped into the room and slowly and nervously approached the coffin. As Justin had guessed, the coffin was completely empty. Perhaps the female ghost had flown out of here. Suddenly, Justin remembered that the I Ching could repel evil spirits and avoid misfortune. So he returned to his room to find the I Ching scrolls and placed them around the coffin. After that, he went back to his room to observe. As dawn approached, the female ghost flew back from the neighboring yard, intending to enter the room. However, she was struck by a beam of golden light that prevented her from entering. The female ghost tried several times to enter, but each time she was repelled by the light. At that moment, it seemed like she had noticed Justin secretly watching her from the darkness of the room opposite. Suddenly, she broke open Justin's window to his surprise. She rushed toward him, gripping his neck tightly, her anger evident. Justin could clearly see the horrifying appearance of the female ghost, leaving him speechless in fear. In his delirium, Justin heard the crow of a rooster and then lost consciousness. When he woke up, it was already bright outside. Justin could still feel the pain from the ghost squeezing his neck, his whole body drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. But what was even more terrifying was that Justin was horrified to find the corpse of the female ghost lying next to him. His body stiffened, and he felt his life force draining away. He sensed that death was near. A week later, the stench of decay emanated from the house. Villagers discovered the young man's body in the room, covered in blisters, and beside him was the dried up corpse of the woman. They took both of them and disposed of them. From that time on, the villagers whispered to each other about the men who suddenly went mad after being haunted by the female ghost, or about the mysterious death of the young man Justin after encountering the ghost. This chilling tale tells of a man named Peter Parker, an accountant by profession, who specialized in balancing books and helping others with their finances. One day, he had to travel to a nearby town to settle the accounts of a client. He bade his wife and children farewell, promising to return home soon. The town buzzed with activity, bustling with the hurried energy of end-of-year trade and commerce. Once Peter finished with his last client's accounts, he quickly said his goodbyes and began his journey home. The shortcut from the town to the harbor was dark and foreboding. He carried a lantern and hurried, deciding to walk to save money by refusing the offer of a horse-drawn carriage. After walking for miles, a strange weariness began to grip him. Everything felt off. The farther he walked, the more exhausted his legs became, yet his destination remained elusive. Just then, through the trees, he spotted a grand mansion. Thinking it might be a place to ask for a drink of water and directions, Peter approached and knocked on the door. A servant appeared, and Peter explained his need. However, the servant seemed reluctant to let him in. At that moment, an elderly man appeared and instructed the servant to invite Peter inside. He seemed unbothered by the unexpected guest. The old man, with a kind and welcoming air, invited Peter to join him for dinner. He also warned that the woods were treacherous at night and suggested Peter stay the night, leaving in the morning for his own safety. Peter, not wanting to seem impolite, accepted the invitation. Having heard of robbers in the woods, he thought it wise to stay the night rather than risk traveling further. After some conversation, Peter learned that the old man had several daughters. He then suggested the old man invite his daughters to join them for dinner. The old man took a sip of his tea, cleared his throat, and called his daughters. Peter glanced up, and his eyes immediately widened in shock. Out of the room came 5 young women, each in her 20s, with ethereal beauty, gentle and demure, radiating an almost otherworldly grace. As the dinner continued, Peter no longer had any appetite. He hadn't expected this mansion to be home to such mesmerizing women. Eating became secondary, and even the weariness in his body faded. Peter felt a strange exhilaration, caught in a web of enchantment. Every woman he laid eyes on was more stunning than the last. He was astonished that such beauty could exist in this remote mansion, a secret no one had ever spoken of. To his further surprise, as the dinner progressed, the old man noticed Peter's distracted gaze and nodded, subtly hinting that he was considering marrying one of his daughters to Peter and inviting him to stay. Peter, initially ready to agree, hesitated when he thought of his wife and children. His conscience pricked at him, and he confessed the truth. The old man, unfazed, replied that in these modern times it was normal for men to have multiple wives. He casually suggested Peter choose one of his daughters as a second wife. Peter found himself in a dilemma, as all 5 daughters were stunning, and the idea of choosing one was unbearable. Seeing Peter's discomfort, the old man offered an intriguing solution. He could live with all 5 daughters according to their family tradition, and after a time, choose the one he desired most. Hearing this, Peter felt as though he had fallen into a vivid, fantastical dream. He could no longer refuse the temptation. Over the following days, Peter spent time with each of the 5 daughters in turn. The more he spent time with them, the more confused he became. Each night he lay with a different woman, each one leaving him stirred and yearning, but this indulgence began to drain his energy. One night, after a passionate encounter with the youngest, Peter collapsed in exhaustion and quickly fell into a deep, troubled sleep. Suddenly, a loud noise erupted outside, accompanied by flashing lights. Peter thought thieves had arrived and scrambled to his feet, alarmed. He instinctively reached to protect the woman beside him, but when he turned, she had vanished. The door was suddenly flung open, and armed figures stormed into the room. They demanded confirmation of Peter's identity. Gesturing for him to follow, they ushered him out of the room. Peter believed they were thieves who intended to kill him. He panicked, looking back to see smoke rising from the mansion. He muttered prayers, begging for his life. Once outside, Peter turned around to look back, and the smoke cleared. There was no mansion, no family, only a desolate grave, smoke billowing from its open mouth. As Peter stood there, still in disbelief, a few people approached. They murmured to each other, confirming that they had found everything. Peter was bewildered and had no idea what was happening. Then his gaze fell to the ground, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Scattered on the ground were the bodies of a large fox and 5 smaller ones. He learned from the group that they were hunters hired by his wife to track him down. Peter thought he had spent a month at the mansion, but in reality, only 3 nights had passed. His wife, concerned when he hadn't returned, sent people to search for him. He was shocked by how quickly he had been drained of energy. Thankfully, his kind-hearted wife had forgiven him and cared for him when he returned. After recovering, Peter found that he could no longer engage in marital relations. However, the ordeal had taught him a lesson. He no longer indulged in the pursuit of fleeting beauty, and instead returned to his loving wife, cherishing her and their children more than ever. It is said that two scholars were traveling to the capital to take part in an exam. The one in purple robes was named Tony, and the one in blue robes was named Thor. As night fell, they began looking for a place to rest. Arriving in the town late at night, all the inns were already full. During the exam season, most scholars had reserved rooms in advance, leaving nearly no vacancies. The two men asked from one inn to the next, but every place was fully booked. Just as they were about to give up, Tony noticed a light glowing in the distance from an inn. He quickly told Thor to hurry over and check if they could find a room there. They approached and asked, and to their luck, there was still a room available. They decided to stay. However, it seemed the innkeeper had tripled the price, but Tony was willing to pay that extra cost. To maintain peace and quiet, the two decided to sleep in separate rooms, with a wall between them. Just as Tony was about to fall asleep, the door to his room suddenly flew open. At first, he thought perhaps the innkeeper had arranged for them to share a room with other guests, thinking the man was just being cheeky. But when he looked closely, two figures stood before him, both strange and unsettling. One of them was a towering figure, so tall that his head nearly touched the ceiling. He wore a blue hat and blue robes, with a thick, eerie blue beard. The other figure was short and plump, also dressed entirely in blue. As these strange individuals entered the room, a chill ran through the air, causing Tony's body to stiffen in fear. What happened next shocked him even more. The two figures began dancing in a bizarre manner, accompanied by strange drumming. Tony broke into a cold sweat, his body paralyzed. He tried to cry out to Thor for help, but no sound came from his throat. However, he could clearly hear Thor's voice coming from the room next door, pleading for help. Just as Tony's heartbeat grew frantic and he felt himself slipping into unconsciousness, a third figure appeared, a man wearing a headscarf and a scruffy beard. This man seemed to be the leader of the two odd figures. He growled at the two blue-clad individuals, warning them not to touch the person before them. With the leader's arrival, Tony was able to sit up and hear Thor's voice from next door, still calling for help. Thor appeared, stumbling towards Tony's room. His legs were weak, his gait unsteady, and his pants hung loosely as if he had just endured something horrendous. Thor was visibly terrified, his eyes swollen with tears, and his face smeared with snot. He muttered that he had just seen ghosts, his account of the event shockingly clear. Thor explained that, as he was about to sleep, the door had blown open unexpectedly. Suddenly, terrifying faces with glowing green eyes appeared in the dark, slithering and growling as they crawled under his bed and hovered over him. The monstrous faces loomed closer, suffocating him as he gasped for air. At that moment, Thor could only freeze in fear, unable to speak, as the grotesque heads swirled around his bed. Just as he thought he was going to die, the terrifying faces recoiled and disappeared. It seemed they had seen something beneath his pants that frightened them, and they vanished. Both men were convinced that something was deeply wrong with the inn. They quickly changed clothes and decided to stay awake together until morning. As the rooster crowed at dawn, they immediately saddled their horses and fled the inn, not daring to look back as they made their way to the capital. During that year's exams, Tony passed with the highest honors. There were rumors that Tony was destined for greatness, and some believed that his survival was due to divine protection. After the ordeal, Tony learned that the inn where he and Thor had stayed was the site of a horrifying event. All 28 scholars who had stayed there during the exam season had mysteriously died under unknown circumstances. This terrifying story is about a wealthy man named Ronald Tramp, who was famously stingy in the area. He didn't need to do anything as he inherited a vast fortune from his father's investments. One day, he took his dog named Lele to a tavern for a meal. He ordered some delicious dishes and enjoyed the meal to his heart's content. He had always lived this way, carefree, without a wife or children. While eating, a beggar outside the door called out asking for food. Mr. Tramp was used to this scene. The beggar, so hungry that he staggered while walking, weakly begged Mr. Tramp for some leftover food to fill his stomach. At that moment, Mr. Tramp raised a chicken leg in front of him. The beggar knelt down, holding out a bowl as if expecting to receive the chicken leg. Everyone in the tavern was surprised by Mr. Tramp's generosity. "Lele, this is for you. After eating, you have to guard the house and keep the door safe." But the food wasn't for the beggar. It was for his dog, which was sitting under his feet. Mr. Tramp then ordered the waiter to chase the beggar away, claiming that the beggar was ruining his appetite. After finishing his meal, he wandered around the market. By now, it was starting to get dark. Mr. Tramp was slightly drunk. A sudden urge to urinate hit him. He unbuckled his pants and walked into a narrow alley. Although he could have held it until he got home, Mr. Tramp decided to relieve himself right there, to save on water for washing at home. He stood by the wall, starting to take care of his needs. The smell of urine made him more alert, and he briefly noticed someone sitting next to him. He thought, who would be sitting here, doing their business in public? He thought he was the only one relieving himself, but someone else was so frugal that they were defecating in the street. But when he looked closer, wasn't it the beggar from earlier? Why was he dead here? Even more terrifying, the beggar had his eyes wide open, staring directly at him. Mr. Tramp cursed, quickly pulled up his pants, and walked out, not forgetting to splash a bit of urine onto the beggar's corpse. As soon as he stepped out of the alley, Mr. Tramp saw several ragged individuals fighting over something. Oddly, why were these strange young men playing around here at night? Upon closer inspection, it was a fresh, delicious-looking peach. In the mood, Mr. Tramp grabbed the peach. He thought the beggars didn't deserve such a delicious fruit. They must have stolen it from somewhere. Since he was craving some fruit to freshen up after the meal, he eagerly bit into it, enjoying the taste. After finishing, he wiped his mouth, expecting the beggars to glare at him, but instead, they gave him a strange smile. Suddenly, Mr. Tramp felt his stomach grumbling. Even though he had just eaten, he now felt extremely hungry. To his horror, he noticed his face sagging. He touched it, and within moments, his cheeks sank in. His clothes also became loose. He had visibly lost weight. Shocked, he realized that from being a fat man, he had turned into a skinny beggar. Just as he was still reeling from the shock, he heard his dog growling. The dog no longer recognized him. The dog lunged at him and started biting furiously. Mr. Tramp was completely bewildered, not understanding why his dog was acting so aggressively. He quickly ran away from the dog he had raised for so long. Once he reached the market street, his stomach growled in agony, as if it were being torn apart. He thought about going to a tavern to fill his stomach, and quickly ran toward it. However, after patting himself down, he realized he had no money on him. This was strange. He always kept money in a hidden pocket in his coat. At this point, his intestines ached terribly, and Mr. Tramp felt the intense pain of hunger. He had no choice but to beg for food, but the tavern owner chased him away without hesitation. Unable to endure the hunger, Mr. Tramp saw some leaves by the roadside. He thought, "I'm too hungry now. I'll risk it and eat these for now." He immediately grabbed the leaves and stuffed them into his mouth. Mud and insects mixed in with the leaves, but he swallowed them all. But the more he ate, the more intense his hunger became. He writhed in pain on the ground. After a while of agonizing, he died of starvation right there. His death was a sad sight. Just hours ago he had been full, and now he was dying from hunger in such a pitiful manner. In his delirium, Mr. Tramp saw the beggar's ghost from the alley appear. The ghost told him that what he'd suffered was the same as what the beggar had gone through before dying. If only Mr. Tramp had shown a bit of compassion, he could have saved a life. Suddenly, Mr. Tramp woke up with a start. He realized that, at some point, he had fallen asleep next to the beggar's dead body. He sighed in relief, realizing it had all been just a nightmare. Perhaps he had fallen asleep because he was too drunk, but the fear still lingered. He knew the nightmare had served as a warning to him. So, he hired people to clean up the beggar's body and bury it properly. Now, his conscience had awakened after experiencing the agony of starving to death. From that moment on, Mr. Tramp became more generous and began doing good deeds. He worked harder, saving money to help more poor people. The story is about a man named Jackie Chan, whose family was so poor they barely had anything to eat. He survived by doing calligraphy on the streets, but during tough economic times, he lost even that job. With no rice left to cook, his wife urged him to come up with a solution, but he couldn't think of anything. His wife then told him to either steal or rob someone, saying it was better than sitting at home waiting to starve to death. But Jackie Chan, being lazy, kept making excuses that he wasn't capable of doing anything. His wife, furious, exclaimed that if he continued to be useless, she would have to sell herself to earn money to feed a lazy man like him. This led to a fierce argument between the couple that lasted the whole evening. That night, Jackie Chan couldn't sleep. Hungry and thinking about his wife's scolding, he went outside for some fresh air, feeling both annoyed and ashamed. He thought to himself, "Am I really so worthless that I'd let my wife sell herself to save me? If that's the case, I'd rather die." With that thought, he tied his belt to a tree and prepared to end his life. Just as he slipped the noose around his neck, he suddenly saw the apparition of his late father. "You useless fool, you're strong and healthy, yet you lie around doing nothing. And now you think hanging yourself is the answer? Even if you have to steal or rob, bring home money to support your wife. Fine, let me give you a tip. In the neighboring village, there's a monster wreaking havoc. Go there, wait, and you'll find money. Trust me." After saying this, his father's apparition disappeared and the belt snapped, sending Jackie Chan tumbling to the ground in pain. Back in his room, Jackie Chan thought about what had just happened. Could this be a sign from his father? No, tomorrow I'll become a thief. Let's see who dares to look down on me after that. Determined, he decided to try his father's advice and check out the neighboring village for opportunities. Early the next morning, Jackie Chan headed for the neighboring village. His wife tried to stop him but couldn't. When he arrived, he saw a notice posted on the wall of a large house and went closer to read it. The notice stated that the Kim family had been troubled by a monster recently. Anyone who could eliminate the monster would be rewarded with 100 silver taels. The story went that a few nights ago, the young lady of the Kim family was asleep when a strange man climbed into her room. The man was hideous, but had an unnaturally long tongue. He looked at the young lady with a greedy expression. The young lady tried to scream for help, but the man immediately thrust his long tongue into her mouth. She became paralyzed, unable to make more than a faint whimper before falling unconscious. The next morning, the maid and the wet nurse found the young lady naked and violated. She only woke up when they entered the room. After recounting the incident, the young lady urged them to keep the matter quiet to protect her reputation. She also revealed that the strange man had promised to return that night. That evening, the maids and wet nurse armed themselves with sticks and stood guard both inside and outside her room, waiting for the long-tongued monster to appear. Sure enough, the strange man returned that night, walking in confidently as if no one could stop him. In the blink of an eye, he opened his mouth and exhaled a murky gas. The maids who approached him immediately fainted. The man then carried two of them into the young lady's room. Inside, he was surprised to find the young lady, the maids, and even the wet nurse already unconscious on the bed. Had his gas been so effective that it reached inside without him realizing it? By the next morning, the two maids who had been guarding the door were missing. Everyone else in the room had been violated, including the wet nurse. Only then did they report the incident to the Kim family patriarch, who was furious. If word of this spread, the Kim family's reputation would be ruined. So, the patriarch posted a notice calling for skilled individuals to eliminate the monster. Jackie Chan thought to himself that the Kim patriarch must have prepared the reward money. Instead of fighting the monster, he decided to sneak into the estate that night to steal the silver. That night, recalling his father's advice, Jackie Chan armed himself with a wooden stick and hid in the fields near the Kim estate, planning to steal the reward money amidst the chaos caused by the monster. Following his father's instructions, he waited patiently until it was late and quiet. However, he dozed off without realizing it. He was eventually awakened by strange noises. Peeking out, he saw a strange man with an odd figure heading toward the Kim estate's wall. Jackie Chan thought, "Damn it, someone's beat me to it. All I did was nap for a bit." Noticing the bundle on the man's back, Jackie Chan assumed it was filled with stolen money. Seeing the man about to leave, he thought, "I should knock him out and take the money for myself." With that, he sneaked closer. Raising his wooden stick, he struck the man hard. Fearing retaliation, he delivered a second blow while the man was down. Summoning all his courage, he kept striking, his intention now shifting from robbery to murder. His eyes gleamed with malice. "If society won't let me live honestly, I'll become a thief," he thought, beating the figure relentlessly. But when he finally stopped and looked, it wasn't a man lying on the ground. It was a massive soft-shell turtle he had beaten to death. Jackie Chan immediately called the Kim patriarch to show off his heroic deed. To his surprise, his attempted theft turned him into a monster-slaying hero. The Kim patriarch ordered the giant turtle to be cooked as a nourishing soup and rewarded Jackie Chan with silver. From then on, the Kim family was free of disturbances, and Jackie Chan returned home with money, beginning a better life with his wife. This terrifying story is about a merchant named Mao who ran a large tavern in the town. The wine here was very cheap, yet it had a delicious taste. However, after drinking it, there was a bitter aftertaste. This type of wine, once consumed, would make the drinker feel light-headed, as if floating on air, followed by a deep sleep. Many people asked Mao about his secret recipe for the wine, but he claimed it was a family secret passed down for generations, and even with money, he would never reveal it. In truth, there was no secret recipe at all. Mao simply mixed narcotic substances into the wine, causing anyone who drank it to fall into a dazed and trance-like state. One day, a young man with a long face and sharp eyes appeared at the tavern. He was a regular customer. He ordered a jug of wine and began drinking it eagerly. While cleaning, Mr. Mao suddenly heard a loud noise. Looking back, he saw that the young man had collapsed to the ground. Mr. Mao thought the customer had drunk too much and passed out, so he went over to check on him. Upon closer inspection, Mr. Mao was startled. The sight before him was so terrifying that it left him horrified. Lying on the ground was clearly a fox dressed in clothes. Mr. Mao had never expected that the wealthy young man, Yan, was actually a fox spirit in disguise. So Mr. Mao tied the fox tightly with a rope, planning to take it to the authorities the next day to claim a reward. After a while, the fox woke up and transformed back into the young man. He pleaded with Mr. Mao to spare him. At this point, Mr. Mao remembered that a beautiful woman in town had often been harassed by a fox spirit at night. After some questioning, it turned out that the fox spirit had been the one causing the trouble. Mr. Mao then asked the fox spirit how it was able to sneak into the woman's house without anyone noticing, and how it could make her obey its will. The fox spirit revealed that it had a magical item stored in its den, and if Mr. Mao spared its life, it would give him this item. Mr. Mao was thrilled at the thought of learning a magical technique which would allow him to do whatever he wanted without being discovered. Mr. Mao grabbed the edge of the fox's cloak, feeling as if his feet were no longer touching the ground. The wind howled in his ears, as if he were riding on a cloud flying through the sky. The fox led him to its lair. Soon they landed inside a stone cave. The fox spirit took out a set of clothes and said that if Mr. Mao wore them, no one would be able to see him. He could do whatever he wanted and go anywhere without being noticed. Mr. Mao eagerly took the cloak and returned home, eager to test its powers. As promised, when Mr. Mao put on the cloak, no one in the house could see him. He was delighted, feeling that he had discovered a precious treasure. When Mr. Mao returned home, it was time for dinner. He sneaked into the room where his wife was waiting for her meal. He took off the cloak and happily entered the room, not wanting his wife to know about this magical item. Mr. Mao thought about the magical treasure and felt a sense of excitement. In his mind, he began to plan how to use it for his own desires. That night, after his wife had fallen asleep, Mr. Mao quietly got up and put on the special cloak. He then quietly left the house and made his way to the beautiful woman's house on East Street. His heart was filled with excitement about the plans he was about to carry out. Mr. Mao knocked lightly on the door. The silence was broken only by the faint sound of the knock, as if preparing for something unexpected. The maid at the house heard the knock and came out to check. She looked around but saw no one. Taking advantage of the situation, Mr. Mao joyfully stepped into the yard and quietly approached the beautiful woman's room. Inside, he heard the sound of water splashing. Turned out that the woman was taking a bath at that moment. Mr. Mao gently pushed the door open and entered. His excitement grew as he realized that his long-held dream was about to come true. A seductive scene unfolded before his eyes. A pair of slender legs appeared, and the beautiful woman, whom many men in the town had desired, was naked in the bath. Mr. Mao immediately felt his blood rush, his mind becoming restless, especially when he noticed the woman's undergarments. Unable to control himself, Mr. Mao moved forward to carry out his immoral intentions. Just then, beams of bright golden light shot through the window, striking Mr. Mao's body like needles. At that moment, he noticed a charm hanging on the wall. Panicking and frightened, Mr. Mao hurriedly fled from the scene. The next day, still furious and unwilling to give up, Mr. Mao returned to East Street to see what was happening. He found a crowd gathered in front of the beautiful woman's house, full of curiosity. Inside, a great monk was performing a ritual to exorcise evil spirits. The charm on the wall had been drawn by the monk, who was now using his magic. Suddenly, Mr. Mao felt his entire body contract in pain, as if he were being tortured. He quickly ran away from the crowd. Realizing that Mr. Mao was the evil spirit, the people immediately chased after him. Mr. Mao panicked, ran home, and as soon as he entered the door, he called out for his wife. But not long after, he collapsed and transformed into a large fox, to the astonishment of his wife. The great monk seemed to know that this was the work of the fox spirit's dark magic, and seeing the wife's desperate plea, he refrained from killing the fox. The wife brought the fox back to the room and tended to it, hoping it would return to its human form. But just 3 days later, the fox breathed its last and transformed back into Mr. Mao. It is said in the town that some believed Mr. Mao was punished for making fake wine to sell to customers, while others believed he had fallen victim to the fox spirit's curse, becoming a replacement for death.